The words hung in the air between us like a confession, trembling with the weight of a 12-year-old's newly discovered truth. Grandma, I'm adopted. My grandson Danny sat across from me at the kitchen table, his dark eyes searching my face for a reaction. The afternoon sun streamed through the window behind him, casting a golden halo around his dark, curly hair so much like mine had been at his age. In his hands, he clutched a slightly crumpled piece of paper. What I would later learn was his original birth certificate, discovered while rummaging through his parents' filing cabinet for his social security card for a school trip. I set down my teacup carefully, my hands steadier than I felt. 23 years of secrets pressed against my chest, demanding to be released. But not yet, not like this. And how do you feel about that, sweetheart? I asked, my voice calm despite the storm raging inside me. He shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant, but I could see the uncertainty in the way he gripped that paper, the slight tremor in his shoulders. I don't know. Weird, I guess. Mom and Dad never told me. I found this paper, and it has different names on it, and then there's this amendment stapled to it with their names, and... He trailed off, looking down at the document as if it might rearrange itself into something that made more sense. What Danny didn't know, what he couldn't know yet, was that I was the one who had adopted him, not Margaret and Thomas, the people he called Mom and Dad. Me. Eleanor Walsh, 68 years old, sitting in my modest kitchen in Portland, Oregon, was his legal mother on paper, and had been since he was 3 days old. The secret I'd carried for more than a decade sat like a stone in my throat. To understand how a grandmother ends up adopting her own grandchild, you have to go back to 2002, to a cold February night when my daughter Claire came home at 17 years old with terror in her eyes and a secret of her own. Mom, I'm pregnant. 3 words that changed everything. Claire had always been my wild child, the one who pushed boundaries and tested limits. After her father died when she was 12, she'd spiraled in ways I couldn't catch. She found solace in the wrong crowds, comfort in the wrong choices. By 16, she was staying out late, dating boys I never met, keeping secrets I couldn't penetrate. But that night, when she stood in my living room with tears streaming down her face, she was my little girl again, frightened and small and needing her mother. Okay, I said, pulling her into my arms. Okay, sweetheart. We'll figure this out. Over the next few days, the story came out in pieces. The father was a boy from another school, someone she'd met at a party. He was 18, heading to college, had his whole life planned out. When she told him about the pregnancy, he'd panicked, said terrible things, accused her of trying to trap him. He wanted nothing to do with it, with her, with any of it. Claire wanted to keep the baby. Despite everything, despite being 17 and still in high school with no job and no prospects, she wanted to be a mother. But Mom, she said, her hands protectively over her still flat stomach, I'm scared. I don't know how to do this. I don't know if I can. That's when the plan began to form. Claire was young, too young in so many ways. She wanted to finish high school, maybe even go to college. She wanted the baby to have a stable life, 2 parents if possible, a real home. But she couldn't bear the thought of giving the baby to strangers, of never knowing, of cutting that cord completely. What if I adopted the baby? I said one night, about a month after she told me. We were sitting in my bedroom, looking at the small pile of baby clothes I'd saved from when Claire and her sister Margaret were little. Claire looked up at me, confused. "What do you mean?" "Legally adopt. I would be the mother on paper. You could still be in the baby's life as the big sister or the aunt or whatever we decided. And when you're ready, really ready, when you have your life together, then you could take on the full parenting role. You'd never really lose your baby, but the baby would have stability. Security." Claire's eyes filled with tears. "You would do that?" "Sweetheart, I would do anything for you." And for this baby, it wasn't a perfect solution. It wasn't even a conventional one. But in that moment, it felt like the only way forward. Daniel Michael Walsh came into the world on September 15th, 2002, at 3:47 in the morning, screaming his tiny lungs out with a force that seemed impossible for a creature weighing only 6 pounds, 11 ounces. Claire held him first, crying as she counted his fingers and toes, as she traced the curve of his perfect little nose. I stood back, giving them that moment, watching my teenage daughter fall in love with her son in a way that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. "He's perfect," she whispered. "He is," I agreed. 3 days later, at the hospital, I signed papers that made me his legal mother. Claire signed papers relinquishing her parental rights. The social worker who processed the paperwork looked at us with confusion. A 45-year-old woman adopting her teenage daughter's baby. But everything was legal, everything was proper. Unusual, but not unheard of. We brought Danny home together, Claire and I. We'd worked out the story we'd tell people. Claire had gotten into some trouble, and I was raising her baby while she got her life back on track. It was close enough to the truth that it didn't feel like lying. What we didn't anticipate was how natural it all felt. How Claire would get up for late-night feedings without being asked. How she'd hold Danny for hours, singing softly to him. How fiercely protective she'd become. And how gradually it became clear that she was more than capable of being his mother. But the paperwork said differently. I was his mother. She was his birth mother, his legal sister, his everything and nothing all at once. Claire finished high school with Danny in a bassinet in my spare bedroom. She went to community college, taking classes during the day while I watched Danny. Then coming home to care for him while I worked evening shifts at the hospital where I'd been a nurse for 20 years. She dated a young man named Rick when Danny was 2, and for a while, I thought maybe this was it. Maybe this was when the truth would come out, when Claire would reclaim her son officially. But Rick wasn't ready for a child, especially one that wasn't biologically his, even though Claire never told him Danny was actually hers. The relationship ended badly, and Claire retreated into herself for months. My other daughter, Margaret, had taken a different path. She'd gone to college, gotten a degree in business, married her college sweetheart Thomas, and moved to Seattle where he worked for a tech company. They'd been trying to have children for years, but fertility issues had left them heartbroken and empty-handed. When Danny was 3, Margaret came to visit for Thanksgiving. I watched her interact with Danny, the way she lit up when he called her Aunt Maggie, the way she helped him build block towers and wiped his runny nose, and read him the same book 17 times without complaint. On her last night there, after everyone else had gone to bed, she sat with me at the kitchen table. the same table where, 10 years later, Danny would tell me he'd discovered he was adopted. "Mom," Margaret said carefully, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to really think about it before you answer." I waited, my hands wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea. "Thomas and we've been talking to an adoption agency. We want to adopt. But seeing Danny this week, I keep thinking—" She paused, gathering courage. "What if we adopted Danny?" The tea suddenly tasted bitter. "What? I know how hard this has been on you. You're raising a toddler in your late 40s when you should be enjoying your freedom. And Claire?" "Mom, Claire isn't really in a position to be a full-time mother. She's still figuring out her own life. But Thomas and we're stable. We have a house, good jobs. We want a child so badly. And Danny already knows us. He loves us. It wouldn't be like giving him to strangers." I stared at my daughter, feeling the world shift beneath me. "Does Claire know you're asking me this?" Margaret shook her head. "I wanted to talk to you first." "But Mom, think about it. Wouldn't this be better for everyone? Better for Danny?" I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, listening to Danny's soft breathing through the baby monitor, thinking about what Margaret had said. She wasn't wrong. Raising a toddler at my age was exhausting. I'd given up any thoughts of retirement, of travel, of the quiet life I'd imagined after my girls were grown. My back ached from lifting Danny. My patience wore thin after long shifts at the hospital, followed by bedtime routines. And Claire? Claire was trying so hard, but she was still so young, still figuring out who she was. But Danny was my boy. Not legally mine in the way biology would make him, but mine in all the ways that mattered. I'd been there for his first word, "Mama," which broke Claire's heart and mine in different ways. His first steps. His first everything. The thought of giving him to Margaret, even though she was my daughter, felt like losing him. The next morning, I talked to Claire. We sat on my bed while Danny played with trucks in the living room, his happy babbling filtering through the house. "Margaret wants to adopt Danny," I said without preamble. Claire's face went white. "What?" I explained the conversation, watched emotions play across Claire's face. Shock, anger, hurt, and then something that looked like reluctant understanding. "What do you think?" she asked finally. "I think it's your decision as much as anyone's. He's your son, Claire, even if the papers say otherwise." Claire was quiet for a long time, her fingers twisting the blanket on my bed. "Sometimes I look at him," she said softly, "and I feel like I'm not enough. Like I'm failing him somehow. I'm 20 years old, Mom. I should be out with friends, dating, figuring out my life. Instead, I'm sneaking in homework after he goes to bed and working part-time at a coffee shop. Margaret has everything. The husband, the house, the stability. Maybe he'd be better off with her." The conversation with Margaret and Thomas happened 2 weeks later at my house. Claire insisted on being there. We sat around my dining room table, me, Claire, Margaret, and Thomas, while Danny napped upstairs, unaware that the adults were discussing his entire future. "I want to be clear," Claire said, her voice stronger than I expected. "If we do this, I don't disappear from his life. I'm still his aunt. I still get to see him, be part of his life." "Of course," Margaret said quickly. "We wouldn't want it any other way. He loves you. And when he's older, Claire continued, looking down at her hands. When he's old enough to understand, I want him to know the truth. I want him to know I'm his birth mother, and that I made this choice because I loved him, not because I didn't want him. Thomas spoke up for the first time. We would never keep that from him. When the time is right, he'll know everything. I watched this unfold, feeling both relieved and devastated. There's one more thing, I said. Legally, I'm his mother. So legally, I'm the one who would be making this adoption happen, not Claire. This has to go through me. Everyone nodded, understanding the complication that our unusual arrangement had created. Are you okay with this, Mom? Margaret asked gently. Was I? I looked at Claire, at the mixture of pain and hope on her face. I thought about Danny, about the life he could have with Margaret and Thomas. The big backyard, the good schools, two parents who desperately wanted him, who had the resources and stability to give him everything. I think, I said slowly, that sometimes loving someone means letting them have a better opportunity than what we can provide, even when it breaks your heart. The adoption process took 9 months. 9 months of home visits and paperwork and lawyers. 9 months of slowly transitioning Danny to Margaret and Thomas's home in Seattle. 9 months of Claire crying herself to sleep some nights while maintaining a brave face during the day. We told Danny that he was going to live with Aunt Maggie and Uncle Tommy. At 3 years old, he was excited about the adventure, about the big house with the yard and the dog that Margaret and Thomas had recently adopted. He didn't understand permanence yet, didn't grasp that this wasn't just a long visit. Claire and I visited every other weekend at first. Then, as Danny settled into his new life, once a month. Then, every few months. It wasn't because we wanted to stay away. It was because Margaret and Thomas gently suggested that Danny needed time to adjust, to bond with them as his parents. They weren't cruel about it, but the message was clear. Too much contact with us confused him about who his real parents were. Claire threw herself into her life. She transferred to a 4-year university, majored in social work. She told me once, late at night after too much wine, that she'd chosen that field because she wanted to help other young mothers who faced impossible choices. She wanted to be there for people the way no one had really been there for her. I went back to my quiet life, my empty house. I worked my shifts at the hospital, visited Margaret and Thomas and Danny when I could, and carried the secret of those early years like a stone in my pocket, always there, always heavy, always sharp around the edges. Danny grew up calling Margaret and Thomas Mom and Dad. He knew me as Grandma Eleanor, which was technically correct, even if the path to that relationship was more complicated than he knew. He knew Claire as Aunt Claire, the cool aunt who sent him birthday presents and took him to movies when she visited. Years passed. Danny started kindergarten, then elementary school. He was bright, curious, kind-hearted. He loved soccer and science experiments and books about space. He looked like Claire, the same dark curly hair, the same quick smile, the same way of tilting his head when he was thinking hard about something. Sometimes I wondered if Margaret saw it, the resemblance between Danny and Claire, if she'd ever put the pieces together. But if she did, she never said anything. Which brings us back to that afternoon in my kitchen, to Danny sitting across from me at 12 years old with his birth certificate in his hands, telling me he'd just discovered he was adopted. Do you know anything about my birth parents? He asked, and the question speared through my heart. Mom and Dad won't tell me anything. They say I should wait until I'm older to have that conversation. But Grandma, I need to know. Who am I? Where did I come from? I looked at my grandson, my son, on paper, and felt the weight of 23 years of secrets pressing down on me. Why did you come to me? I asked. Instead of staying home and talking more with your parents? Danny's eyes filled with tears. Because they've been lying to me my whole life. Because I don't know if I can trust what they tell me anymore. Because you've always been honest with me, Grandma. You've always told me the truth. The irony of that statement nearly broke me. Danny, I said carefully, this is a conversation you need to have with your mom and dad. Not because I don't want to help you, but because they're your parents. They love you. They have their reasons for waiting to talk about this. But do you know who my birth parents are? He pressed. I could lie. I could shake my head, plead ignorance, send him back to Margaret and Thomas to handle this mess. Or I could start unraveling the truth, pulling at the thread that would unravel 23 years of carefully constructed stories. Yes, I said finally. I know who your birth mother is. Danny leaned forward, his whole body tensed with anticipation. Who? I think, I said slowly, that I need to call your parents first. This isn't information I can just give you without talking to them. But Danny, I promise, that you will know the truth. Soon. Okay? He looked frustrated, but nodded. Okay. How did you even get here? I asked, suddenly realizing he must have taken a bus or something from Seattle. I took the train, he admitted. I used my allowance money. I told Mom and Dad I was going to Jake's house after school. We need to call them. They're probably worried sick. They don't even know I know yet, Danny said. I found the papers yesterday, but I didn't say anything. I just left after school today and came here. I sighed, reaching for my phone. This is going to be a long night. Margaret and Thomas arrived at my house 2 hours later, their faces tight with worry and anger and fear. Margaret immediately went to Danny, pulling him into a hug he didn't quite return. Don't you ever do that again, she said fiercely. We were terrified. You can't just leave like that without telling us where you're going? You mean like how you never told me I was adopted? Danny shot back, pulling away from her. The room went silent. Thomas spoke first. So you know. Yeah, I know. I found my birth certificate, the real one and the amended one. Danny's voice cracked. Why didn't you tell me? Margaret sat down heavily on my couch, her face pale. We were going to. We always planned to. We wanted to wait until you were old enough to understand. I'm 12. How much older did I need to be? There's more to the story than you know, Thomas said gently. It's complicated, buddy. Then uncomplicate it, Danny shouted, and I saw Claire in him, the same passion, the same intensity. Tell me the truth. Who were my birth parents? Why did they give me up? Do they know about me? Do they ever think about me? I watched Margaret and Thomas exchange a look, a whole conversation happening in that glance. Finally, Margaret turned to me. Mom, we need Claire here for this. Danny frowned. Why Aunt Claire? Because, I said quietly before Margaret could answer. She's part of this story too. Claire arrived just before dinner, driving down from Portland, where she now worked as a social worker for the state. She'd been in a meeting when Margaret called, but she'd left immediately. She came through my door looking terrified and determined in equal measure. "Hi, Danny," she said softly. "Why are you here?" he asked, confused. "Because," Claire said, sitting down in the chair closest to him, "we have some things to tell you. Important things, and I'm part of the story." We all gathered in my living room. Me, Claire, Margaret, Thomas, and Danny. Danny sat on the couch, looking between all of us like he was trying to solve a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit. Margaret started talking first. "Danny, you need to know that you were always wanted, always loved. Everything we did because we thought it was best for you." "That's what everyone says," Danny muttered. "But what does it mean?" Claire took a deep breath. "It means that 12 years ago, when you were born, I was your birth mother." The words dropped like stones into still water, the ripples spreading outward. Danny's head snapped toward Claire, his eyes wide. "What?" "I was 17 when I got pregnant with you," Claire continued, her voice steady even as tears slipped down her cheeks. "I was young and scared and not ready to be a mother. But I wanted you. I loved you from the moment I knew you existed." "But you're my aunt," Danny said, his voice small and confused. "I'm your birth mother," Claire corrected gently. "And yes, I'm also your aunt. Because after you were born, Grandma Eleanor adopted you, legally. She became your mother on paper so that you'd have stability while I finished growing up." Danny turned to look at me, betrayal written across his face. "You? You adopted me?" I nodded, feeling tears burn behind my eyes. "I did, sweetheart. I became your legal mother when you were 3 days old." "So you're actually my mom? And Aunt Claire is my mom? And Mom?" He looked at Margaret. "She's actually my aunt?" "I'm your adoptive mother," Margaret said softly. "When you were 3, your grandma, your birth grandmother, allowed Thomas and me to adopt you. Because we wanted a child so badly, and because we could give you a stable home with 2 parents. Your Aunt Claire, your birth mother, agreed to it because she loved you enough to want what was best for you." Danny was shaking his head, processing, trying to make sense of it all. "So let me get this straight. Aunt Claire is my birth mom. Grandma Eleanor is my first adoptive mom. And you," he looked at Margaret, "are my second adoptive mom?" "That's right," Thomas said gently. "And my birth father?" Claire's face tightened. "He wasn't ready to be a father. He made that very clear when I told him I was pregnant. He's not part of your life, and that was his choice, not ours." Danny sat back, looking overwhelmed. "This is insane. This whole thing is insane. Why didn't anyone just tell me?" "Because we were trying to protect you," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "We didn't want you to grow up feeling confused or like you didn't belong anywhere." "Well, I feel pretty confused now," Danny said, his voice rising. "I feel like my entire life has been a lie. Like I don't even know who I am." "You're Danny," I said firmly. "You're the boy who loves soccer and science. You're kind and curious and stubborn when you believe in something. You're the boy who spent an entire summer building a robot out of spare parts when you were 8. You're the boy who reads to the neighbor's cat because you think she gets lonely. You're exactly who you've always been." "But I'm not who I thought I was," Danny said, and the pain in his voice cut through all of us. "I thought Mom and Dad were my parents. I thought Aunt Claire was just my aunt. I thought Grandma was just my grandma. Now I find out that I'm, what, a family project?" Passed around from person to person? You were never passed around, Claire said fiercely. You were loved. So much loved. Every decision we made was because we loved you. Danny stood up abruptly. I need some air. He walked out my back door into the yard, and we all sat in heavy silence. Claire was the one who followed him outside. Through the window, I could see them sitting on the bench under my old apple tree, talking. Claire's hands moved expressively as she spoke, and Danny listened, his posture gradually softening from defensive to something more open. They were out there for almost an hour. Inside, Margaret cried on my couch while Thomas held her. We should have told him sooner, she kept saying. We should have been honest from the beginning. We were doing what we thought was right, Thomas said, but even he sounded unsure. When Claire and Danny finally came back inside, Danny's eyes were red, but he looked calmer. I think I'm starting to understand, he said slowly. I'm still mad and confused, and I'm going to need time to process all of this. But I think I get why everyone made the choices they made. What did you two talk about out there? Margaret asked. Claire smiled softly. I told him about the day he was born. How I held him and counted his fingers and toes. How I sang to him every night for his first 3 years. How hard it was to let him go to Margaret and Thomas, even though I knew it was the right thing to do. And I told him that not a single day has gone by when I haven't thought about him, haven't loved him, haven't been grateful that he exists. And I told Aunt Claire, Danny paused, my birth mom, that I need to figure out what to call everyone now, because this is really confusing. That got a small laugh from everyone, breaking some of the tension. You can call us whatever feels right to you, Margaret said. I'll always be Mom if you want me to be. But I understand if that changes now. Danny shook his head. You're still my mom. You're the one who raised me, who taught me to ride a bike, who helps me with my homework. That doesn't change. But now I also have Claire, who's my birth mom. And Grandma, who's like my super mom? Legal mom? I don't know. We need to figure out the terminology. We have time, I said. We have all the time in the world to figure this out. I do have one question, Danny said, looking at me. Why did you adopt me in the first place? Why didn't Claire just let Margaret and Thomas adopt me from the beginning? I glanced at Claire, who nodded, giving me permission to answer. Because Claire was 17 and not ready to make that kind of permanent decision, I explained. She wanted to keep you in the family while she figured out her life. And I wanted to give her that option. So I became your legal mother as a kind of bridge. A way to keep you with us while Claire grew up. We never knew, back then, that Margaret and Thomas would end up adopting you. That came later. So everyone was just making it up as they went along? Pretty much, Thomas said with a small smile. That's what families do. We figure it out as we go, and we do our best, and sometimes we make mistakes. This was a pretty big mistake, Danny said, the not telling me part. You're right, Margaret acknowledged, and we're sorry. We should have told you sooner. We should have been honest. Danny nodded slowly. Okay, apology accepted, but from now on, no more secrets. If there's anything else I should know, you need to tell me. We all agreed, and I felt something loosen in my chest, the grip of that long-held secret finally releasing. The months that followed were strange and difficult and ultimately healing. Danny started seeing a therapist who specialized in adoption issues. It helped him process the complicated feelings that came with discovering his origin story was more like a soap opera than a simple narrative. Claire became more present in his life. She started visiting every other weekend again, and she and Danny would go out together to movies, to dinner, to the science museum that Danny had loved since he was little. They were building a relationship that was different from what they'd had before, but also familiar. She wasn't trying to replace Margaret as his mother, but she was stepping into her role as his birth mother in a way that felt right to both of them. Margaret struggled the most, I think. She felt guilty for not telling Danny sooner, worried that he would love her less now that he knew the truth. But Danny was gentle with her in his own way, making sure to hug her before bed, telling her about his day at school, asking for her help with projects just like he always had. Thomas was the steady presence he'd always been, the calm in the storm, the one who could make Danny laugh when things got too heavy. And me? I found myself in an odd position, no longer carrying the weight of the secret, but still grappling with my role in Danny's life. Was I his grandmother? His former legal mother? His guardian angel? All of the above? One Saturday afternoon, about 6 months after the revelation, as we'd all come to call it, Danny came over to help me with my garden. He was 13 now, gangly and growing into his features, his voice starting to crack at odd moments. We were pulling weeds in companionable silence when he said, out of nowhere, "I'm glad you adopted me, Grandma." I looked up, surprised. "You are?" "Yeah. I mean, the whole thing is weird, and I wish I'd known sooner. But if you hadn't adopted me, Claire might have given me up to strangers. And then I wouldn't have this family. I wouldn't have Mom and Dad, and I wouldn't have you and Claire in my life. So, yeah, I'm glad." Tears stung my eyes. "I'm glad too, sweetheart." "Can I ask you something?" "Anything. Do you ever regret it? Adopting me and then letting Mom and Margaret adopt me. Do you wish you'd kept me?" I sat back on my heels, considering the question. "Sometimes I wonder what it would have been like if I'd raised you," I admitted. "But regret? Number, because you got to have the life you deserved. 2 parents who love you completely, a stable home, opportunities, and I still got to be part of your life, even if it wasn't in the way I originally planned. I got to be your grandmother, which is a pretty special role too." Danny nodded, processing this. "I think I understand now why grown-ups say things are complicated, because this is really, really complicated." I laughed. "Yes, it is. But you know what? Some of the best things in life are complicated. Love is complicated. Family is complicated. That doesn't make them any less real or important." "Thanks, Grandma." "For what?" "For everything. For adopting me. For loving Claire enough to help her. For being honest with me once it all came out. For just being you." I pulled him into a hug, this boy who was growing taller than me now. This child who had taught me so much about love and sacrifice and the many ways a family could be built. 2 years later, when Danny was 15, we had what we jokingly called the family summit. All of us gathered at Margaret and Thomas's house for a weekend to talk about how things were going, how everyone was feeling, and what the future might look like. Danny had matured a lot in those 2 years. He was in high school now, thinking about college, driving with his learner's permit. He'd become more comfortable with his complicated family structure. even occasionally joking about it with his friends. "I have 2 moms and 1 supermom," he told them, and somehow that made it easier to explain. Claire had met someone, a kind man named Michael, who worked as a teacher and who understood Claire's past and her relationship with Danny. They were serious, talking about marriage, and Danny liked him. "Do you think you'll have more kids?" Danny asked Claire during that weekend visit. Claire smiled. "Maybe. Would that be weird for you?" Danny shrugged. "A little, but also kind of cool. I'd have siblings, sort of. Half-siblings." "You know," Claire said carefully, "no matter what happens, if I have more kids, if I get married, whatever, you're always going to be my firstborn. Nothing changes that. Even though I'm also your nephew and your cousin, or whatever weird thing I technically am." "Even though," Claire confirmed. "Biology is just one way to define family. Love is what really matters." During that same visit, Margaret pulled Danny aside. I watched from the window as they walked around the backyard together, talking seriously about something. When they came back inside, both of them had obviously been crying, but they were holding hands and smiling. "Everything okay?" Thomas asked. "Everything's great," Margaret said. "We just needed to have a talk." Later, Danny told me what they'd discussed. "Mom was worried that I didn't love her as much anymore," he explained. "Now that I know about Claire and everything, so I told her that finding out about my birth didn't change who raised me. It didn't change who I run to when I'm scared or sad. It didn't change who knows exactly how I like my sandwiches cut or what to say when I'm frustrated. That's her. That's always been her." "What did she say?" I asked. "She cried a lot," Danny said with a teenage boy's bemusement at maternal emotions. "But I think she understood." On Danny's 16th birthday, Claire gave him a gift that made him cry. It was a journal, a beautiful leather-bound book with thick, cream-colored pages. Inside, she'd written him a letter, chronicling her pregnancy, his birth, those first 3 years of his life. She'd included photos I'd taken, ultrasound pictures she'd kept, even the bracelet he'd worn in the hospital. "This is your story," she wrote in the introduction. "The whole story, from the very beginning. You have a right to know where you came from and how much you were loved, even when things were complicated." She'd written about the night she told me she was pregnant, about her fears and hopes, about the first time she felt him kick, about choosing his name, Daniel, after my father, his great-grandfather who had died before Danny was born. She'd written about the adoption decision, both adoptions, and how hard it was to let him go while knowing it was right. She'd written about watching him grow up from a distance, about the pride she felt in the person he was becoming. And at the end, she'd written, "You asked me once if I regretted having you when I was so young. The answer is no, never, not for one single second. You are the best thing I ever did. You are my heart walking around outside my body. And while I may not have raised you day to day, you shaped who I became. Everything I've done, every choice I've made since the day I found out I was pregnant, it's all been influenced by you. You made me want to be better, do better, live better. You are my greatest teacher and my greatest gift. Thank you for being my son, even if the world knows me as your aunt. Thank you for letting me love you in whatever way I can. And thank you for being exactly who you are." Danny read the journal alone in his room, and emerged hours later with red eyes and a new understanding of the sacrifice everyone had made for him. "I'm not going to lie," he told us all at dinner that night. "This is still the weirdest family situation ever, but I think I'm starting to realize how lucky I am. Most kids get one mom, maybe two if they're adopted. I got three. That's not something to be angry about. That's something to be grateful for." Danny's story didn't just affect our immediate family. It rippled outward in ways we couldn't have anticipated. Claire's work as a social worker took on new depth and meaning. She specialized in kinship adoption cases, situations where family members adopted relatives' children. She understood the complications, the emotions, the delicate balance of maintaining connections while providing stability. She became an advocate for open adoption, for honesty, for letting children know their stories from the beginning. "I don't want other kids to go through what Danny went through," she told me once. "Finding out at 12 that your whole life was built on secrets? That's traumatic. Kids deserve to know their stories, even when those stories are complicated." She wrote articles about kinship adoption, spoke at conferences, consulted with agencies on best practices. Danny's story, our story, became, in anonymized form, a case study in what to do and what not to do when family members adopt within their own family. Margaret, for her part, became involved in support groups for adoptive parents. She shared her experiences, her mistakes, her learning process. She helped other parents understand the importance of honesty, even when the truth was complicated. "We thought we were protecting him," she told these groups. "But we were really protecting ourselves from having difficult conversations. Kids are more resilient than we give them credit for. They can handle complexity if we're honest with them." Thomas used his tech skills to create a website and forum for families in unusual adoption situations, kinship adoptions, step-parent adoptions, adoptions that didn't fit neat categories. It became a resource for thousands of families navigating similar waters. And Danny? Danny surprised us all. When he was 17, applying to colleges, he wrote his main essay about his experience, about being adopted twice, about discovering his origin story, about learning that family could be defined in many ways. He wrote about the pain of discovery, but also about the gift of truth, about how knowing his whole story helped him understand himself better. He got into every college he applied to. The admissions officers said his essay was one of the most compelling they'd ever read. Honest, mature, reflective. He chose to study social work, following in Claire's footsteps. "I want to help families like ours," he explained. "Families that don't fit the traditional mold, but are trying their best to do right by their kids." On a quiet Sunday afternoon when Danny was 18, home from his first semester of college, he asked if we could all get together, me, Claire, Margaret, and Thomas, for what he called a family reflection. "I'm taking this psychology class about family systems," he explained. "And I've been thinking a lot about our family, about how we work, about what it all means. I want to hear from each of you what your experience was like. Not for a class or anything, just for me. I want to understand everyone's perspective." So we gathered at my house, the place where so much of this story had unfolded, and we talked. Margaret went first. "When Thomas and I adopted you, I was terrified," she admitted. "Terrified that I wouldn't be enough. that you'd somehow sense I wasn't your real mother, that I'd fail you. Every time you got sick or hurt or sad, I wondered if a biological mother would know better what to do. It took me years to accept that I was your real mother, maybe not biologically, but in every other way that mattered. She paused, collecting her thoughts. Not telling you sooner was my biggest fear manifesting as action. I was afraid that if you knew the truth, you'd love me less. You'd see me as less legitimate. By the time I realized that wasn't true, that our bond was strong enough to withstand the truth, you were already 12, and telling you felt impossible. And then you found out on your own, which was my worst nightmare come true. But it turned out okay, Danny said gently. It did, Margaret agreed. Better than okay, eventually, but I'll always regret not being braver sooner. Thomas spoke next. My experience was different because I came into this from the outside, he said. You weren't my biological nephew. I didn't have the same history with Claire that Margaret did. When we decided to adopt you, I was just a guy who wanted to be a dad. And you made me one. You taught me what it meant to be a father, the patience, the worry, the overwhelming love. He smiled at Danny. I won't lie. It was strange sometimes, watching you interact with Claire and Eleanor, knowing they had this connection to you that I didn't. But I also realized that family isn't a competition. You having multiple mother figures didn't diminish my role as your dad. If anything, it meant you had more people loving you, looking out for you. How could that be anything but good? Claire was next. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. For me, the hardest part was living with the choice I made, she said. Even though I knew it was right, even though I could see you thriving with Margaret and Thomas, there were nights I'd cry myself to sleep, missing you, missing being your mother in the day-to-day way. She looked directly at Danny. When you were 4, you called me Claire for the first time, instead of Aunt Claire. It was such a small thing, but it felt like confirmation that I'd stepped back enough, that you saw me as separate from your mom. And I was grateful for that. It meant the adoption was working. You were bonding with Margaret, but it also broke my heart a little. I didn't know that, Danny said softly. How could you? You were 4, Claire said with a sad smile. But here's the thing I eventually learned. I was still your mother, just in a different way. I was the mother who made the impossible choice to let you go so you could have a better life. That's a mother's love too. It's just expressed differently. Finally, it was my turn. I was the bridge, I said, between Claire's youth and her readiness to parent, between her love for you and her inability to provide what she felt you needed. I adopted you thinking I might raise you, but I was prepared to be flexible, to see where life led us. I looked around at everyone gathered in my living room. When Margaret and Thomas adopted you, I felt both relieved and heartbroken. Relieved because I knew you'd have a wonderful life with them. Heartbroken because I'd fallen in love with you in those 3 years. You weren't just my grandson or my legal son. You were my baby, mine to protect and nurture. But you let me go, Danny said. I did. Because that's what you do when you love someone. You make choices based on what's best for them, not what's easiest for you. And watching you grow up, seeing the person you've become, I know we made the right choice. Danny was quiet for a moment, absorbing all of this. Can I tell you what my perspective is? He asked. We all nodded. When I first found out, I felt betrayed. He began. Like everyone had been lying to me my whole life. Like I didn't even know who I was anymore. But as I've processed it, as I've had time to think and feel and understand, I've realized something important. He looked at each of us in turn. I am exactly who I've always been. Danny Walsh. I'm the son of Margaret and Thomas, who raised me and loved me and taught me to be the person I am. I'm the biological son of Claire, who gave me life and made the hardest choice a mother can make. I'm the legal son of Eleanor, who provided the stability and bridge I needed. And I'm the grandson, nephew, cousin, whatever complicated thing I am to all of you. He leaned forward, his expression earnest. Most people spend their whole lives wondering if they're loved. I've never had to wonder. I've been loved so much by so many people that you all twisted yourselves into knots trying to figure out how to best show that love. That's not a tragedy. That's a gift. Danny's words hung in the air, and I saw Margaret wipe tears from her eyes, saw Claire smile through her own tears, saw Thomas nod in agreement. But, Danny continued, I do think there are things we could have done better. Things I want to make sure I do differently if I'm ever in a similar situation. Like what? I asked, curious about what wisdom this young man had gained. Honesty from the beginning, Danny said immediately. I understand why you all made the choices you made, but I think if I'd known my story from early on, age-appropriate information as I grew, it wouldn't have been such a shock. It would have just been part of my normal. Claire nodded. You're right. I've learned that in my work too. Kids who grow up knowing they're adopted from the beginning generally have an easier time with it than kids who find out later. Exactly, Danny agreed. And the other thing is, I think we need to normalize complicated families. We're not broken or weird or dysfunctional. We're just different. And different isn't bad. When did you get so wise? Margaret asked with a teary laugh. I had good teachers, Danny replied with a grin. As the afternoon faded into evening, we ordered pizza and fell into the comfortable rhythms of family, jokes and stories, gentle teasing and genuine affection. Looking around at this group of people, at this family we'd built in such an unconventional way, I felt a deep sense of peace. We'd made mistakes, certainly. We'd kept secrets too long, handled things imperfectly. But underneath all the complications, underneath all the unusual legal arrangements and complicated relationships, there was love. So much love. Time has a way of putting things in perspective. Now, 5 years after Danny discovered the truth, 10 years after that afternoon in my kitchen, I can see our story more clearly. Danny graduated from college with a degree in social work and a minor in psychology. He's now working at an adoption agency, helping facilitate kinship adoptions and advocating for open, honest relationships between birth families and adoptive families. Claire married Michael, and they have 2 children, a boy and a girl. Danny adores his half-siblings, and they adore him. He's Uncle Danny to them, but they know the whole story of his connection to their mother. Claire made sure of that, telling them in age-appropriate ways from the beginning. Margaret and Thomas are still married, still living in Seattle, still Danny's parents in every way that matters. They've relaxed into their role, no longer fearful that the truth will diminish their importance in Danny's life. They've learned that love doesn't diminish when it's shared. It multiplies. And me? I'm 78 now, slowing down a bit, but still active, still involved in my grandchildren's lives. All of them, from Danny to Claire's little ones, to the children of friends and neighbors who've become like family over the years. Danny comes to visit me often. We garden together, cook together, talk about his work and his life. Sometimes he brings dates to meet me, and I've learned not to interrogate them too much. Though it's hard, I want to make sure they're good enough for my boy. Just last month, Danny brought his girlfriend Sarah to dinner. She's lovely, smart, kind, works as a teacher. After dinner, while she was helping Margaret clear the dishes, Danny pulled me aside. "I told Sarah about my family," he said, "about how complicated it all is. About you adopting me, and then Mom and Dad adopting me, and Claire being my birth mother." "What did she say?" I asked. Danny grinned. "She said it sounded like I came from a family that knows how to love each other even when it's hard. She said that's the kind of family she wants to be part of someday." My eyes filled with tears. I like her. I like her too, Grandma. A lot. As I watched Danny and Sarah together that evening, laughing with Margaret and Thomas, talking seriously with Claire about adoption practices, playing with Claire's kids, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. Our family wasn't built the traditional way. Our story isn't neat or simple, but it's ours, and it's real, and it's filled with love. On my 70th birthday, Danny gave me a letter. Not a card, a letter, handwritten on nice stationery, several pages long. "Don't read it now," he said. "Wait until later, when you're alone." So I did. That evening, after all the guests had left and the house was quiet, I sat in my favorite chair with a cup of tea and opened the envelope. "Dear Grandma Eleanor," it began. "I've been wanting to write this letter for a long time, but I could never find the right words. I'm not sure I have them now, but I'm going to try. I want to thank you for being brave. Brave enough to adopt me when Claire needed help. Brave enough to let me go when Margaret and Thomas could offer me something different. Brave enough to tell me the truth when I asked for it, even though it was hard. I used to wonder what my life would have been like if you hadn't adopted me that first time. If Claire had placed me with strangers right away, or if she'd tried to parent me alone. I don't think either of those paths would have led me here, to this life, to this family. You were the keystone that held everything together. You made it possible for Claire to keep me close while still giving me the stability I needed. You made it possible for Margaret and Thomas to become my parents without severing the connection to my birth mother. You held space for all of us to be complicated and messy and human. I know it wasn't easy. I know you carried the weight of that secret for 12 years, and that must have been incredibly hard. I know you gave up things, freedom, peace of mind, the simple joy of just being a grandmother, to be what our family needed. I want you to know that it mattered. Everything you did mattered. Every sacrifice you made, every hard choice, every moment you put my needs above your own, it all mattered. I am who I am because of you. I'm also writing to tell you something I've realized lately. I used to think our family was broken, that we'd made a mess of things that we had to learn to live with, but I don't think that anymore. I think our family is brave. We're a family that faces hard truths. We're a family that makes difficult choices out of love. We're a family that doesn't give up on each other, even when things are complicated. Yes, we made mistakes. You all should have told me sooner. I still believe that. But that one mistake doesn't cancel out all the things you did right. It doesn't cancel out Claire's courage in admitting she wasn't ready to parent. It doesn't cancel out your willingness to step in and be what we needed. It doesn't cancel out Margaret and Thomas's love and dedication. I'm writing this now because I want you to know, before any more time passes, that I understand. I understand why you did what you did. I understand the impossible position you were in. I understand the love that motivated every choice. And I want you to know that I don't just forgive you for keeping the secret. I'm grateful for everything you sacrificed to make my life possible. You asked me once if I was glad you adopted me. I said yes then, and I'll say it again now. I'm so glad. I'm glad you were brave enough to take a chance on an unconventional solution. I'm glad you loved Claire and me enough to do something difficult. I'm glad you were my legal mother, even if only for a few years, because it means I have that connection to you always. You're not just my grandmother. You're my guardian angel, my safe harbor, my North Star. You're the person who taught me that family is what we make it, not what society tells us it should be. Thank you for adopting me. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for being you. With all my love, Danny. P.S. Sarah and I are getting engaged. I wanted you to be the first to know. We're going to tell everyone else next week, but you're first because you're special. I hope you'll help me pick out a ring. You have good taste, and I want to get this right. I read the letter 3 times, crying harder each time. Not sad tears, grateful tears, healing tears. All those years ago, when Claire came to me pregnant and scared, I never could have imagined this outcome. I never could have predicted the twists and turns our family would take, the pain and joy we'd experience, the way love would bend and stretch and ultimately hold us all together. I never could have known that a difficult choice made on a February night in 2002 would lead to this. A young man who understood the complexity of family, who chose to see our story not as a tragedy, but as a testament to love. 2 years after that letter, I stood in a garden watching Danny marry Sarah. Claire was there, holding hands with Michael, their 2 children sitting quietly, well, mostly quietly, in the front row. Margaret and Thomas sat beside them, Margaret dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, Thomas's arm around her shoulders. The officiant spoke about family, about the many people who had loved Danny into the person he was today. Danny had insisted on a unique ceremony, not just traditional vows between him and Sarah, but also a moment of recognition for the family that had shaped him. Danny comes from a family built on unconventional love, the officiant said. A family that chose each other in multiple ways across multiple relationships. Today, we honor that legacy of choice and love. Danny turned to face us, Claire, Margaret, me. I asked you 3 to stand up here with me today because each of you is my mother in different ways. Claire, you gave me life. Eleanor, you gave me stability. Margaret, you gave me home. I am who I am because of all 3 of you. There wasn't a dry eye in the garden. After the ceremony, during the reception, Danny danced with each of his mothers. First Margaret, then Claire, then me. When it was my turn, he held me carefully, mindful of my age, swaying gently to the music. Thank you for coming on this wild ride with me, Grandma, he said. Thank you for being worth every twist and turn, I replied. As the evening wore on, I found myself sitting with Claire and Margaret, watching Danny and Sarah dance together, their faces glowing with happiness. We did good, didn't we? Claire said softly. We did, Margaret agreed. We really did, I confirmed. And in that moment, looking at the young man we'd all helped raise in our different ways, I knew it was true. Despite the secrets, despite the complications, despite all the ways we'd stumbled and struggled, we had done good. We had loved a child, each in our own way, each according to our abilities and circumstances. We had made hard choices and lived with the consequences. We had been imperfect and human and brave, and in the end, that child had grown into a man who understood that family wasn't about biology or paperwork or traditional roles. Family was about showing up, even when it's hard. Family was about loving each other through the complications. Family was about choosing each other again and again and again. Danny caught my eye across the dance floor and smiled, that brilliant smile that reminded me so much of Claire, of myself, of all of us. He mouthed the words, I love you, and I mouthed them back. My grandson, my son, on paper, for those important early years. My legacy of love and sacrifice and impossible choices. In the end, the labels didn't matter. What mattered was that afternoon in my kitchen 10 years ago when he said, Grandma, I'm adopted, not knowing the full story of just how true that was. What mattered was that we'd found our way through the truth to something real and lasting. What mattered was love. It had always been about love. And as I watched Danny spin Sarah across the dance floor, as I sat between the two daughters who had both been mothers to him, as I felt the warm evening breeze and heard the sounds of celebration all around, I felt complete. Our story wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and that was enough. This story is a work of fiction, but it touches on very real issues that many families face. Kinship adoption, open adoption, the complexity of multiple parental figures, and the importance of honesty with adopted children about their origins. If you're in a similar situation, please know every family's story is different, and there's no one right way to handle complex family dynamics. What matters most is love, honesty as age appropriate, and keeping the child's best interests at heart. Resources exist for families navigating kinship adoption, open adoption, and other non-traditional family structures. If you need support, reach out to adoption professionals, family therapists, and support groups in your area. Remember, family is what we make it, and love comes in many forms.